Okay, we're at part two now of this, and now we're opening up with partisan activity. Again, a fascinating contrast between the two sides in what's happening in these endeavors. Uh, so, one of the constants for both sides was mining railroads. An incredible amount of damage done um, uh, hitting the rail lines. Um, the Soviet partisans were an enormous amount. Look at the numbers that we have here: 300,000 men. And in both, interestingly, in both partisans, both primarily the French and the Soviets, women are actively involved in what is happening here. And so it's extraordinary what they're doing. And you see the numbers down here. um, 90,000 rail lines blown up, 72 railroad bridges, 1,000 trains derailed. So massive impact on it. And as we'll talk to it later, uh, the partisans were talked about as the fifth Belarusian front. That meant they were of incredible import to the Soviet forces and what happened with them. So this is again, and interesting enough, as was so often the case in World War II, especially in Eastern Front, the excesses of the Germans and the killing squads that went out mobilized and created these partisans because of the extraordinary brutality of what the Germans did to the Russian citizens, considering the Untermenschen. Uh, so here you see them in training. Again, the wooded area of the Pripot marshes and the wilderness of the entire region worked tremendously to protect the partisans. Remember, I think I mentioned before the road network and the um, uh, rail networks is not at all what the Germans are used to, so they don't have the ability to penetrate into this wilderness the way they did in the southern. And here again is the size of the Pripot marshes and how important they are. And here's Minsk up here, and then here's Kiev down here. They get an orientation, and the attack is going to come out through here. And anytime the Germans tried to put units through here, they would be going through a narrow roads, and the partisans would just be able to eat them apart. And the Soviet forces were able to move forces from the south here in Ukraine into the north to Belarus, easily hidden from the Germans. Now this is a map that's hard to see, but basically what it is showing you is how many attacks there were on the road. This is the railroads. These are the railroads going across Belarus. And all of these numbers are how many times it's been attacked. And you can see the enormous number of attacks. And these are the number of attacks across the lines. So it's just extraordinary what they were able to do, what the partisans were able to do in this operation, and the cost it went to them. Now, if we go to the French again are very, very effective in what they're doing with the uh, uh, support. Again, they're not nearly as big as the Russians, as the Soviet forces, but for heaven's sakes, 100,000, and again, women and men, just an extraordinary amount, and what they're doing. And here, again, the training is going on. Again, you see women are involved in this. The role of women in this is really, really quite extraordinary. Um, uh, and and a large number of the fighters here are communists. They're French communists that are fighting with them. And here they are setting up to blow up the roads. Now the danger. Remember, I think I mentioned this before. The road network in the Soviet Union is woeful, and the Germans really aren't prepared for that, and so everything has to go through rails. Now, of course, the rail gauge in the Soviet Union is a different rail gauge, so it makes it difficult for Germans to transport, that they have to cope with that. But so much has to go by rail. The Soviets are used to that to a much greater degree than the Germans are. But what they do is they blow up rail lines. They cause tremendous damage to the Germans' efforts, and then they're able to even waylay the Germans when they come in to repair it. So an enormous amount of manpower has to be taken out of the front lines and put on support in the back. Now, in the French, there's an enormous amount of supplies that are flown in and dropped by parachute into the Partisans, the Free French, the Marquis in France. So radios are sent in, supplies are sent in of all kinds. So it's a relatively easy night flight in from the UK to get supplies in. Now, what's interesting in this with the French Marquis is they're coordinated masterfully by the Allied forces, the Free French forces and the Allied forces. So they pick exactly where they want to hit, and what they tell them to do is cut the telephone wires, cut the power grids, primarily cut the wires, the wire transmission. Why do they want to cut the wire transmissions? Well, because this is all coordinated, because the Allies have, with Ultra, cut the Enigma machine, and they've declassified or decoded the German code. And when the Germans transmit over radio, the Allies are able to decode and understand what that radio traffic is. Obviously, if it's sent over wire, they're not as able to decode it. So this is a concerted effort by the Allies to force the Germans to communicate by radio, and by setting it up by radio, Enigma is more and more able to read the traffic. Patton, on his breakdown from Normandy, uses the intelligence that he gains from this masterfully. Montgomery, to a large degree, doesn't trust it at all to the same degree. So the ultra trap that they set up is really kind of masterful. And of course, they have to do this totally in secret. There's no way they can let the French resistance know what's going on, what their motivation is for asking the French to concentrate on wired communication, but it has playback, and so in both cases, the resistance is coordinated with the major force. They're not independents ranging on their own. And as in the Soviet case, they talked about them as being the 5th Belarusian front. Eisenhower here talks about the resistance being equal to 10 to 15 divisions, which is an incredible asset that he's taking forth here. So, by the way, realize that a massive amount of all the research done on this is done through AI. I use ChatGPT, and I use Gemini, and I use Claude. I don't particularly like Grok, but when you see this little bug here on the picture, this indicates that this image was generated by Gemini, by Nano Banana, and it's just an incredible tool to use. The problem putting things on YouTube is that YouTube enforces copyrights, and so what I would commonly use in my classes, I'm not going to be able to do with this because I have to worry about copyright laws. So a lot of the images you'll see, and you'll see many infographics, they're all generated by this. Now, one of the things here that will come up again and again and again and again, is the fundamental difference between the American way of war and the Soviet way of war. And it's democracy and autocracy at the root cause. That's where it is, where there's control of the Free French forces, but under the Soviet system, there's total central control. So they're under total control. That means there's a party commissar on the ground with them. We'll talk about later. We'll do a session in the future with comparing the U.S. Civil War and the Russian Civil War, and you'll find out that very, very early in that Russian Civil War, Trotsky and Lenin find out that the only way to control the military is to put commissars everywhere. So party representatives are at every level of control. So if there's a colonel equal of the party there with him. And if there's a lieutenant colonel, the lieutenant colonel has a partner who is a party member and a lieutenant, and an incredible control mechanism. There's absolutely nothing like that on the Allied side. There's coordination, there's direction, but not to the degree that the central control is. And we'll get to what happens after the war. Well, here, it's right here. I forgot. So what happens to all these wonderful leaders of the Soviet partisans at the end of the war? To an enormous degree, look at the percentage here that are executed. And these are dismissed. So these are the survivals are rehabilitated. And what it is constantly, here investigated by the NKVD, 1,800 of the leaders, executed 800. And the bottom line is Stalin doesn't trust anyone who's an independent leader. He doesn't trust anyone who has been exposed to Western values and is corrupted in his view, or has the ability to develop. And we'll talk about that later. But of course, this is not at all the case. What happens with the Free French, the Marquis, but it's a pattern that we'll see going on and on and on with the Soviets. Now, the next question we talk about in here, again, is a fantastic question about Overlord and Bagration, is logistics. This is a huge operation, and at the very basis of it, it sounds absolutely crazy that we can do it. So the number of troops engaged, the vessels that are involved in Operation Neptune, the invasion force, is 5,000 to 7,000 ships. If you remember the Longest Day, extraordinary movie on Normandy, the German soldier looks out and fog lifts and he says, the sea is covered, there's all the ships in the world are here. And again, with the marshaling of aircraft, the Luftwaffe is overwhelmingly outclassed, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about close air support, and the unified command and the difference, and the ability of naval fire to come in and to be effective in support. Without that, there could be none. But again, the correlation of forces. Bagration, 1.6 million forces coming in. And again, the numbers we've talked about, a 12-to-1 ratio in tanks and assault guns, a 10-to-1 ratio in tubes, artillery tools, and an 8-to-1 ratio in aircraft. So the marshaling of forces that the Allied forces are able to put together here, both the Western Allies and the Eastern Allies, is absolutely awesome. And it's an incredible story of production. We often read about the stories of production in the United States. We fail to note that the production that went on in the Soviet Union was as incredibly masterful. Now, this is the other story that's here. This is Belarus. This is the accumulation of forces in what's coming in to UK. And so this is the monthly tonnage. And look at the monthly tonnage, up to 2 million tons, an accumulation of 17 million tons, a huge amount of movement. And this goes on, do the same thing with troop buildup. Look at the amount of troops coming in. When some Brits saw the balloons in the air that were anti-aircraft, anti-air balloons, they said that they were really there to hold the island up because the Americans had brought so much stuff with them that was to keep the island from sinking. But look at the numbers here as they grow up to 1.5 million people coming across, and huge, just huge numbers. And here is another example of this. These are the landing crafts. We need landing craft to hit Normandy, huge number of landing crafts. We'll see the numbers. But of course, the Pacific, for the island hopping campaign, we need huge numbers. But it's the variety of the landing craft. You see it represented here in these symbols in what they carry as to how many tanks, how many men go into this troop, how many men and cargo go in here, how many men go into this, and you see it on and on. But it's the variety and the number. So an LST pulls up, drops, opens its tank, and tanks and trucks come pouring out, and an incredible force. And then ducks come in and swim into land and then go right on and transport right across the beach. And then flak ships where they load the LST with anti-aircraft fire, and they were ready to knock down any Luftwaffe came in, but very few came in. And then the rocket salvos, the variant of the Katusha, putting down an enormous volume of fire onto the target area. And then another Ellis landing craft infantry here. You see the men coming up, bringing the ships right up, absent a harbor, and they're coming in. This guy's carrying his bike with him. An incredible variety to solve all the different types. And here you can see how many, and this is not an attack group, this is obviously support groups coming in, separate echelon waves coming in afterwards, but a tremendous concentration and an ability to land an enormous amount. And what this tells us about the production capacity of the United States and the wealth of the United States and marshaling these forces. And here you see the LST, and you see a diagram of how many tanks it can carry and how many troops it can carry, as well as the tanks. So the ability to come in, and so these are the numbers: 4,100 landing craft, and here are all the different varieties, and there's many more varieties than are even shown here. So it shows a tremendous wealth of what goes on. And then the planning that goes into this, one of the things we'll talk to later on is the Americans' genius and organization. This is a Mulberry Harbor. So they're basically going to build in England caissons that will drop here, float piers coming out here. They'll drop caissons out here and sink ships out here as a breakwater. Ships will come in here, they'll dock here, offload. So we don't have to capture Cherbourg. We don't have to capture the ports that Hitler was absolutely assured we would need. And these were all developed hidden in England, and Germany had no idea what was coming. We'll actually talk to we'll look at one of the Liberty ships. It's of a storied nature, and actually was one of the ones that came and actually did, I think, at least two visions to Mulberry Harbor. And here is a ship pulling in to the Mulberry Harbor, pulling out. The troops can pull out the vehicles, roll them right off the deck and onto the shore and into, not necessarily into battle, but bringing in the supplies that are so necessary. An extraordinary operation of organization, and the planning went on way ahead of time. And here's another view of the Mulberry. Now, what is an extraordinary tale about what Mulberry. I think it was either June 17th or June 19th was the backup date for Normandy. If June 6th or June 5th was the first original date, but an enormous Atlantic storm came in and totally destroyed. There were two Mulberries built, one on the American beaches, one on the British beaches, and the one at the American beach, by that incredible storm that came in, was totally destroyed and rendered useless. And thank heavens for the building two of them, because the British one survived and continued operation. And then the other part of the logistics that was so genius is they're actually going to lay a pipeline under the channel, and they're going to come across here, and they're going to bring the petroleum products in through a pipeline that's laid out here. Operation Pluto, and all the organization of planning this, pre-positioning everything to come in here and to get it, is an extraordinary tale of logistics and planning way, way ahead. And here are some of the devices that were designed, engineered, and built and transported to England to support this. And here you see a classic picture of the wealth of information of what's being poured across, and the lines, the queues of trucks pulling supplies in for the troops that are going forward. Now, let me come back to this before we go on. What you have to realize, I forget if we're going to cover the Battle of the Atlantic in this section or not, but the Battle of the Atlantic, clearing the U-boats out of the North Atlantic and the Atlantic, none of this could happen without the clearing of the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. And the Battle of the Atlantic is another effort that is Herculean in its task, and the organization that goes into that, and the planning and coordination is just masterful, and part and parcel of this. All right, we're gonna cut it here and take pause this, and then take it here and go to this planning section. So I'll pause it right here.